So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is the third of our spring series for the Get More Dirt on Your Soil program. My name is Steve Yorjo, and I am the county agent with Ocean and Atlantic counties based in Ocean County as part of Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Did this in partnership with the Ocean County Soil Conservation District. So I will introduce my partner in crime, Becky LaBoy, who's the Education and Outreach Specialist with the Ocean County Soil Conservation District. Both of our organizations are regional/county-based organizations that work throughout the state. For Cooperative Extension, we are basically the outreach arm for the university, where we take what is researched and learned at the university out into the general public and also other agencies such as municipalities, environmental organizations, county governments, etc., to work with them for what I deal with, which is natural resource protection, water, air, and soil. We also have the Soil Conservation District, which works throughout the state of New Jersey in different counties and different regions to protect our soil resources and also deal with development issues, but as well as education. And I do like to say that uniquely for Ocean County, we only have one education coordinator and specialist, and we are fortunate enough to have that person in Ocean County helping us. So Becky, you are unique and we appreciate you for that uniqueness. But I do want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. As I mentioned, this is the third of our webinar series for this year. I will put in the chat the link to the webpage that includes last year's recordings as well, that did an introduction to soil and soil structure, as well as testing soil and soil compaction. But this year we were talking basically around a theme of nutrients and organic matter and soil health. So we had some people talk about the soil biology and then also the organic material that's found in soil, then what the usefulness of that is. And one of the ways that you can add more organic matter to your soil is through composting. So we get to wrap up tonight by having you guys learn something about something that you can do at home to help deal with the health of your soil and add more nutrients, and also help with some food waste issues as well too, or any waste issues that you might have at home. But I will let Sandra jump into that in a few minutes. But we are very happy to have Sandra Blain-Snow here this evening. She is the recycling program aide with the Ocean County Department of Solid Waste Management. And she has been involved with the county and the Master Composter program. You've been involved with the county for only a few years, but for several years you have been involved with the Ocean County Master Composter program. So we are very happy to have her here this evening to share her expertise on composting and to help you guys kind of get started and learn how to break ground on composting and moving forward with that. So with that very brief introduction, thank you so much, Sandra, for being here. Just another reminder, everyone, that we will be recording this presentation this evening. And also, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat for us. Both Becky and I will be monitoring the chat. Send it to either myself or to Becky so that we see those and we can go back and forth. And then at the end, we will present the questions to Sandra for answering. But thank you all for joining us tonight. And Sandra, with that, you are free to take this away. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight.
Okay, well, thank you both to Steve and Becky for helping me through this. And thank you to everyone out there for joining us tonight. Thank you for taking the time to spend your evening with us and learning more about composting. So I like to think of this, we're breaking ground on composting. And if you have tuned in for the previous two sessions about soils, this is more about how to feed your soil through composting. I'll talk a little bit about soil, but it will be very basic, maybe more like middle school level, because I really want to jump in and talk about how you can start improving your soil by making compost in your own backyard. And then first, I just have to get in a real quick plug for the Ocean County Master Composters. As Steve said, I've only been with the county officially for a few years, but I've been with Ocean County Master Composters since 2001, and I've had the pleasure of teaching the program since 2006. And the Ocean County Master Composters, like the Master Gardeners, we are trained and certified volunteers, And we are here for the residents of Ocean County to teach them how they can start composting in their own backyard and reduce the amount of organic waste they are making. And while I've been with the program since 2001 as a volunteer, this program actually dates back to 2000. So last year we celebrated our 20th year. It was a very quiet celebration because of the year we had. And another thing is that we did receive an award from the NJDEP for Outstanding Education Program. So if you are at all intrigued by what you hear tonight about composting and you want to learn more and you want to give your time, please consider joining us as a volunteer. And without further ado, let's review what we're going to be talking about tonight. So first of all, we're going to talk about what compost is and what composting is. We'll talk about the difference between soil and compost, what good soil is, what bad soil is, what the difference is. And then we'll talk about why you want to make compost. And for me, it's not just about making a soil amendment that's wonderful for your garden, because my full-time job is recycling for Ocean County. I think of composting as a wonderful way to create less waste. Then after we talk about that, we're going to move on and talk about composting equipment. I'll give a brief overview over what's out there, what you may want to consider purchasing, making. Certainly, many of these items are optional. You will not go into debt buying composting equipment or making compost. Then we'll talk about how compost is actually made, what the process is, and what you will need to know to be successful composters. Then we're going to talk about two different styles of composting, hot versus cold composting. And then finally, we'll talk about troubleshooting. Not that any of you are going to have any problems. Everything is going to go very smoothly. But if you do encounter any problems, you'll be prepared. So what is compost? Okay, well, it looks a lot like soil. In fact, it looks like really good soil. Typically, when you hold compost, it's going to look dark. It's going to smell earthy like soil. It's also going to be full of important nutrients and micronutrients, more than what you would find in your average fertilizer. The other thing is composting itself. I like to think of it as the first original form of recycling. Long before we started recycling glass and paper and cardboard, and more recently plastic, mankind and womankind, we were recycling our organic matter. Once nomadic tribes settled down and started to stay in one place, they found out that they could no longer leave their waste behind. Their waste was right next to them. So what to do with it? So they discovered that much of their waste could be turned into a soil amendment that would help their crops grow. And one of my favorite little tidbits that I happened to see in research for this PowerPoint was that 1 cubic yard of compost can equal $562 worth of plant growth products. And that's why we call it the real black gold. But if you think about what you have spent so far, and it's only May, on garden products, say topsoil, bags of garden soil, bags of compost, think about the fact that you can make many of those products in your own backyard and save all that money. So let's take a look at soil and compost. In the one slide, you'll see the soil in the background. You'll see a hand holding the soil. And if you look at it, that's really pretty good looking soil. That's not bad soil right there. But what is the first thing that you see? What jumps out at you? You see rock particles, little chunks of rocks in there. There's organic matter in there, but you probably can't really see that because it's all broken down and has mixed into the soil. Certainly there are living organisms in there. There's minerals, gas, water. If you look at that hand holding that soil, that's probably a fairly good like moist soil, if they were to squeeze that together, it would hold together and then crumble apart. Compost, on the other hand, is a soil amendment. I like to think of it as soil helper. And compost is actually organic material. If you look at the two hands holding that compost, you'll see that it looks darker. It's also, you can still see a few little bits of organic material in there, a few stray pieces of, I don't know, a fibrous material. And maybe that's a twig. And you can definitely see living organisms in there. If you look at the one little item in there, I'm pretty sure that's an earthworm. So that is the difference between soil. The other thing is soil exists in your yard. Compost is something that you make to add to your yard to make it better. Okay, so we're going to talk very briefly about soil types. As you can see, you will see 4 different colors, and you will see clay, loam, sand, and silt. Soil is made up of 3 particle types: clay, sand, silt. And whatever the dominant particle is in the soil, that's the type of soil you have. And you're looking at this and you're going, but wait, there's that 4th one. There's loam, that dark, wonderful, rich looking material there. Loam is the type of soil that we all want, and few of us actually have it. If you have loam soil, you are very lucky, or you are a very hard worker. So what is loam? Again, particle type, you have 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. So as you can see, pretty much even ratios of sand and silt with a smaller amount of clay. So here's an experiment that I like to do. It's simple. If you want to try this at home, many people will go out and will send in their soil sample to find out what type it is. But you can do this in your own yard and your own house. So basically, you're going to want to get a glass jar. My favorite to use is actually a mason jar. I drink out of them. I use them for this soil experiment. I just make sure that I never mix up my water glass with my soil sample. Go out into your yard. And when I was a master gardener, when we told people to submit a soil sample, we would typically tell them to go and take soil not from one spot in their yard, but multiple locations and mix it all together. And that's great in theory, but I also happen to know that in my garden, I have different types of soil in different areas. So sometimes what I want to do is I want to find what's going wrong with one particular area in my yard. If your yard looks pretty much the same and you're pretty happy, you can definitely take it from different locations. But say you have an area in your yard where nothing really wants to grow, the soil doesn't look good, I would recommend digging there. And you're going to fill that jar halfway full with your soil sample. Then you're going to add water to it, and you're going to leave an inch at the top. What you're going to want to do, and this is very important, put the top on that glass jar and make sure that you put it on tightly before you shake it, because you don't want this experiment to go wrong. You could have a bit of a mess. So once you have that lid screwed on tightly, you're going to take that jar and you are going to shake it very well until you make sure that everything's mixed up. There's no clods or chunks of soil in there. And then you're going to let it sit for 24 hours and it will settle. And when it settles, you will see different layers. And the different layers, the amount that you see will tell you the type of soil that you have. My mason jar does not come with percentages on the side of it. Some of them might come with ounces. So what you really look for is the bands and how big the bands are. And if you see a lot of clay, then you know that you have a clay soil. More silt, then you have silt. And where we are in Ocean County, our soils along the coastal plain here tend to be very sandy. So you will see more sand in yours. So those are clay, silt, and sand. So, but what we want is loam. So let's talk about our gardens and the soil that we have. Okay, I think all of us would love to have Martha Stewart's garden. I know I would love to have her garden. And most of us might not have that garden. It might not be as bad as the other picture that you see, which is a complete wasteland, but sometimes we feel like that at the beginning of the growing season, or maybe we have a few gardening failures behind us and we want to make that right. So a lot of garden failures, once you get past what we like to call the broad umbrella of environmental factors or environmental stress, which can be anything from wrong plant in the wrong place, poor watering habits, say a sprinkler system that comes on every day for 5 minutes. Um, a big part of a garden failure can be attributed to bad or poor soil. So, going to talk a little bit more about the types of soil. Now, I know some of you are coming from different parts of the state. So, when we talk about sandy soil, if you're out in Hunterton, you may look at us like, what's that? Here, we are very close to the ocean and the beach. So, sandy soil is great. If you're on the beach, it is nice to have beautiful white sandy soil. And there's some benefits to sandy soil. It drains easily. It's easy to work. If you dig a shovel into sandy soil, it's going to be very easy. You can dig sandy soil all day long and not break your back or your shovel. The great thing is plants can establish their roots quickly, which is nice. We want them to establish roots. And the larger particles of sand, that creates larger air pockets. So aeration is something that plant roots like. The downside of sandy soil is that while it drains readily, sometimes it drains way too fast, which means it can dry out quickly. Sand also happens to be low in nutrients. It doesn't hold a lot of nutrients, just like it doesn't hold a lot of water. And because of that, because water and nutrients, because everything's moving so quickly through sandy soil, it's also prone to temperature fluctuation. Think about if you're spending a nice day at the beach, you're sitting on the sand, you're walking on it on a really hot day, you might burn your feet. But by the time evening rolls around, it gets cooler. You can feel it quickly dissipate. And when you feel the sand, it's going to be a lot cooler. Plants do not like sudden fluctuations in temperature. They like a nice, even, steady temperature. Clay soil. I love a clay face mask. It's wonderful. A clay face mask, much like clay, has a lot of nutrients in it. Plants love nutrients. Our skin loves nutrients. Um, and clay holds nutrients really well. It also holds water very well. The very fine particles, however, that are responsible for holding all those nutrients and all that moisture are also, they can form an impenetrable layer. If any of you have ever hit a vein of clay in your yard, or something that we call hardpan, you know that that shovel just stops dead in its tracks and you cannot make any headway with it. The other thing is, if it's going to stop your shovel, it's also going to stop water. It's going to hold on to that water. It's going to be slow to drain. The other thing is, if it's difficult for shovels to penetrate and water to penetrate, it's also going to be difficult for earthworms and other insects to aerate it. Now, silt soil. I like to say it's great if it stays in place because it does, because it is a dust-like, almost dust-like sediment. It tends to blow away if it's dry. It can become compacted. It can crack. But silt soil is actually very high in nutrients. It's light, it's moisture retentive, it's good for growing crops. And when you think about many civilizations, when they developed along waterways or bodies of water because the soil there, you had the water, you had the silt-like soil, which was good for growing crops. But water filtration can be a problem. It can become easily compacted, and then also it's prone to washing away. So I have an overview of basically the Mississippi River. And if you look at that, when you see that brown material there, that is an image of basically silt and sediment that is washing out into the Gulf of Mexico. And that can happen here along waterways and along many waterways. If you're not keeping that silt soil, if you're not adding to it to give it a little more body, it might just wash away. So I know if you were here for the other evening's classes about soil, you probably talked about the soil food web. So I'm going to just go over that a little bit, but I want you to understand that soil is not just dirt beneath your feet. And don't call it dirt. It doesn't like to be called dirt. And dirt is really just something that you wipe off of the bottom of your shoes. It's the stuff that accumulates in your house before you actually end up cleaning and vacuuming. Soil, think of soil as a living organism. Living organisms are within it, but soil is not static. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they first start gardening is they think they can just plop a plant in the ground and that's it. It's good to go. And they also think if you add soil amendments to it once, that's it. You're done. You never have to do it again. But much like a human body, soil also needs to be fed continuously. So soil is an amazing, amazing thing. It is full of all types of microorganisms. It's full of invertebrates. It's got predators that's going to be eating them. It's actually a food chain. If you want to think about it, it's kind of like a food pyramid. You'll see the organic matter there, and then you'll see that the first thing that comes along is fungi and bacteria that will work on the organic material. And you can see you go from the primary consumers to the secondary consumers and then the higher level consumers. But the wonderful thing about this is that the more organic material that is in your soil, the more nutrients will be available for your plants. And this is what gives soil its wonderful, rich, dark color. It makes for healthier soil. And as we know, healthier soil makes for healthier plants. Now I want to take a quick look at what's living in compost. So if you look at this picture, it's kind of a mirror image or a flip. We've flipped the previous image so that the organic debris is at the bottom. And basically, you're seeing the same thing going on. Compost, there you go. There's the organic debris that you start your compost with. It invites the microorganisms, the invertebrates in it, and the insects are eating all of this along with the decaying matter that's being broken down. But another thing is the soil and the compost, all of these microorganisms and invertebrates that are there, they're also providing food for the bats and birds, frogs, toads, and all types of small mammals that are living in your yard. And the wonderful thing about this is by providing what I consider a full course meal, you're actually providing a natural pest control, and that's going to reduce the need for pesticides. So when I talk about composting, I don't just think about it as creating better soil. I also think about it as reducing a need for fertilizer and pesticides. I know we're all out in our yards right now. I will go past and I'll see people working in their yards, and I see the ever-present green wheeled fertilizer applicator that's out there. People are out there, they're putting it on their lawn. They want their grass to grow green and beautiful. You'll see all those dandelions in that photo. People don't want those dandelions. They want them gone. And a lot of people will also wait. It used to be an old philosophy in gardening that, oh, you always went out and fertilized before rain, because when the rain came, it's going to help dissolve the fertilizer and it's going to work it down into the soil and your lawn and feed it better. But what happens many times is that it creates runoff. Think about all the hard surfaces that are around your yard, your driveway, your pathways, walkways. That water that's coming, that rainwater, is actually washing some of that fertilizer away. And as it goes down your driveway and down the street, it can end up in storm drains and waterways. And the downside of this is fertilizer is great for making your lawns nice and bright green, but when it gets in our waterways, it can also turn your water a bright green, which is known as an algae bloom. And we don't want to see that. Also, if you're going to use fertilizer, you want fertilizer to stay put. You don't want it washing away. Now, because I do recycling, I'm always thinking about waste and where it goes. And I can tell you, a lot of it goes to a landfill. And my job is to see that as much of that waste is kept out of the landfill. We want to keep our landfills running as long as we possibly can. And there's a lot of very valuable materials that you don't want to send to the landfill. 25 to 34% of your household and yard waste is organic. Think about the leaves that you rake and the grass that you trim from your lawn. Think about the spent plants that you are pruning back. The other thing is your kitchen waste. Just your kitchen waste, the household kitchen waste, not your yard waste, just the kitchen. We create over 200 pounds of kitchen waste per year, each household that is. And I see those bags sitting in a garbage can or a dumpster full of food waste, and I think, what a waste. I could be making compost out of that. We want to keep that out of the landfill. Why? One, it's a valuable ingredient. It's going to make your soil better. But the other thing is, why waste space in a landfill? There is only so much space left. In Ocean County, our landfill, if we are lucky, we will make it to 2038, and it's now 2021. So we only have so many years left. And then when garbage gets picked up, once you put it to the curb and that garbage truck comes by and picks it up, I can tell you what happens. From a lot of landfill tours I've been on, I can tell you where your waste goes. It gets driven in that truck, it gets weighed, and then that truck will follow a line of other trucks up a road. It will go to what is known as the working face of a cell. Landfills are full of cells, and they will drop their load of waste, and as soon as it is dropped, it's going to be covered with dirt. It's going to be there, it's going to be buried, because the first thing you want to do is cover it to keep the seagulls and other animals out of it. Also, you want to keep the smell down. So what happens to all those organics when they hit the landfill and they're buried? And landfills are sort of like like a sealed, it has a liner, it's completely sealed. What happens to organics is that they create methane gas, because without light and air, organic materials cannot break down aerobically. They will go into an anaerobic breakdown, and methane is the byproduct of it. And thankfully nowadays with methane, many landfills are capturing it and using it for power to help power their plants. But in the old days, we used to have to burn it off. You would see what would be known as a flare. So keep your kitchen waste out of the landfill. All right, and now that I've stopped about my landfill rant, let's talk a little bit more about why you want to make compost. Remember all those soils we talked about: sandy, silt, clay. Compost is going to benefit all those soils. It's going to provide nutrients for your plants. It's going to maintain moisture. It's going to keep the soil temperature average. Instead of having those fluctuations like we talked about with sandy soils, it's going to keep a nice even temp. And we talked about all the insects and microorganisms and the animals. It's going to improve the biodiversity of your gardens. I can tell you that whenever I spread compost on my garden, and I've just done that recently, I have a lot of wildlife in my yard, but I see the activity pick up. I see more birds digging through it. It's just so amazing. And again, that's going to provide a source of food and shelter for the wildlife. And we want to invite wildlife into our yard. The other thing, again, I can't stress this enough, it saves money and resources. And the best thing, it's free. And one of the little tidbits that I found that I loved, you'll see the teaspoon full of soil. That 1 teaspoon holds more microorganisms in it than there are people on this earth. So imagine how many microorganisms are available in 1 cubic yard of soil or compost. So just to talk about wildlife quickly, here is a photo gallery of some of the wildlife that will welcome uh, composting in your yard. It will attract them, and I don't mean in a bad way. We have everything in New Jersey. We're the most densely populated state. But if you can build better soil in your yard and a better garden, you can have so much wonderful wildlife. You can have frogs and toads. There are bats that eat mosquitoes. You have birds. Um, we have 6 year-round bats in our in New Jersey alone. We have 421 butterflies that are native to New Jersey. And if you have rotting fruit that you are putting out into your compost pile, sometimes it's nice just to leave out some rotting fruit. Butterflies don't just like nectar. Some like to eat rotting fruit. And I know a lot of people think chipmunks, squirrels, ugh, raccoons and skunks. Um, they can be a pest sometimes, but I like to think of them as breaking down some of the larger ingredients that go in my compost pile. Anyone, if you've tried composting or you've had leftover corn cobs for one, like the squirrels chewing on, if you try to compost a corn cob, it's going to be around for a very, very long time. When I'm done eating corn, I just throw that cob out in the backyard. The squirrels do the work for me. They grind it, they chew it up, and by the time they're done, it's much smaller when I add it to my compost pile. And if I'm lucky, maybe they drop it there or somewhere close by on their way. So those animals can break down larger materials. And there's so many wonderful reptiles, and do not freak out over snakes. Snakes are not necessarily bad. There's many good snakes, and we all have probably seen the very familiar box turtle. These are all great visitors to welcome. And one of the other things is they also provide the insect control. They help with pests. So by taking a more natural approach and using more compost and less fertilizer and pesticides, you're going to make your yard so much more friendly. So now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of composting. We're going to talk about the tools and equipment that you are probably going to want to consider. First of all, what are you going to do with those kitchen scraps when you're done cooking, making coffee, tea? You're going to want a place to put them. So a compost pail is nice to have by your sink, or if you have a really deep sink like me, you can set it down in your sink. You want it to be convenient for you. There are a number of great compost pails out there that you can purchase. We have one in my office that looks exactly like the one you see on the screen. We do compost in our office. And for years, what I've been actually using is just a plastic Maxwell House coffee container. It works wonderfully well. It has a hand grip on the side. It has a lid. You're going to want to have a lid on your compost pail. And that was just something free. It was something I could have put in my recycling can, but I decided to keep it and use it as a compost pail. And I haven't drank Maxwell House coffee in years, so it's been around for a pretty long time. Now, another item you're going to want to consider is a compost bin. You'll hear me refer to bins and piles. You can certainly have a compost pile. Growing up, I had a pile in the backyard, and my grandparents had a pile, and we just simply tossed our organic matter out there, and we scooped compost out of the bottom. The nice thing about a compost bin is it's neat, it's tidy, it helps hold the materials in place. It's also going to help speed up decomposition because most of them are made out of a black recycled plastic, so black absorbs more heat. So you're probably going to want to definitely consider a bin. You don't have to go and buy one. We're going to talk about some DIY bins that you can make yourself. Another important item to have is a pitchfork. Pitchfork is great because you're going to need to turn that pile. Not necessarily turn it, but if you want, you can just let it sit and rot and decompose. It'll still work. but it's going to work a lot faster and you're going to get compost much more quickly if you actually aerate the pile. And the best way to do it is with a pitchfork. It works a lot better than a shovel. And then I do apologize for the temperature E probe. For some reason, it did flip the E onto the next line, but that is actually a temperature probe, or we also know it as a compost thermometer. And if you're thinking it looks a lot like a meat thermometer or a candy thermometer that you would use for cooking, then yes, it's basically the same thing. The only difference is that the probe portion of it is going to be much longer, because rather than sticking it into a roast or into a pot of candy that you're making, this is going to have to go deep into the compost pile where the temperatures are going to be the hottest. And I never used a compost thermometer. I didn't even know they existed until I took the Master Composter course. And when I got mine, it was a game changer for me, because it helped me see how the process was actually occurring, because composting is really a lot like cooking, and it does involve heat. And the thermometer will tell you what's going on with the process. Another good thing to have is a wheelbarrow. If you're cleaning up around your yard, it's a great way to get yard debris to the compost pile. And when your compost is finished, it's a great way to take the compost and move it to the beds that you want to amend with it. And a really optional item is a compost sifter. You can make one of these easily enough with some wood and some hardware cloth, which is nothing more than a fine metal wire. You can sit that over the wheelbarrow. You can sit it over a container, and you just basically sift it back and forth, just like you would do with flour when you are cooking or baking. And basically all the finer particles will go into your container or wheelbarrow. The larger particles will be held up on the screen, and you can just toss those into your next compost pile that you start. So that's some of the equipment. Let's talk about the different types of bins. The ones that you see here, these are all purchased bins. There are different types, and we'll talk about the pros and cons. So the first and most basic one is called a holding unit. It's great because it's simple, it's inexpensive. You don't have to spend a lot of money. The one that you see right there, the manufacturer is actually one called GeoBin. It's made out of recycled plastic. It comes rolled up in a tight roll in a box. It's great. You unroll it. I would recommend, if you ever get a bin like this, that you take it out on a warm day, put it in your driveway and unroll it, because it's going to be very tightly rolled. So let it heat up, soften, and it will be easier to work. And when you're done, what you do is you just put it into that shape that you see, and there are little pegs that go into the holes to hold it into that shape. The only thing is that it has no top. It's just a holding unit. So if it's very rainy, wet summer or winter, your compost may get too wet. If it's a very dry, windy year, it may dry out too much. You can certainly cover it with a tarp if you want. That's one option. And it is actually a really nice option. I use mine to stockpile ingredients. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the hot versus cold. The enclosed unit, it's nice because it has that lid. It's going to be a little more expensive, but certainly very reasonably priced. You can find these in big box stores, certainly on the internet. And the great thing about it is, because you have that lid, it keeps it, doesn't get too wet, doesn't get too dry. Also, if you have a problem with pests, which you shouldn't, there's a top to keep them out. The tumbler and the turning unit, this always confuses people. The tumbler actually is exactly what it sounds like. Think about your dryer. When it tumbles the clothes dry. A tumbler is great, especially if you have a bad back and you don't want to be bending and turning compost. This one problem with it is that it has no contact with the ground. And we want to have contact with the ground, because by having contact with soil, you're going to invite all those insects and microorganisms in there. The workaround for this is just simply get a shovel full of soil and add that to the tumbler, and you will be adding those microorganisms and insects. You'll maybe even pick up a few worms on the way. And finally, the turning unit. The one you see is at our demonstration garden in Lakewood. This one is actually a two-unit turning unit. A three-unit turning unit is actually the best because one unit will hold new material. As it starts to break down, you can turn it and aerate it and move it into the second unit. And then the third unit would be where you would put your finished compost to cure. It takes up more space, but the large capacity is nice, especially if you have a lot of material. And it's easier to turn because those little pieces of wood, the slats, they can be removed so that you can get in there and turn it more easily. So I said you can do it yourself bins. Here's a couple of examples. The first one, the hardware cloth, and that was the same. It's not cloth at all. It's metal wire. It was what was shown in the compost sifter. You can buy this at a hardware store, or maybe you have some left over. This is one that a neighbor of mine built. They just had some leftover hardware cloth. They made a circular form with it, and they swore up and down by the compost that they got out of it, and they used it for their for their basil, and they said it was some of the best pesto that they made. Another one that's popular is leftover pallets. These can either be wired or screwed together. It can be a little bit bulky and heavy. That's one downside to it. But if free pallets are laying around, you just have to make sure that they're not treated with anything. And I still like to have wire there because the wood slats, I feel like some of the material can get out. So it's a nice option, but it's not one that I typically do. Another one is an old garbage can, and I recommend just if you have an old garbage can that's seen better days, that's the one that you want to drill holes in the sides, and certainly drill holes in the bottom or cut the bottom out completely so that can have full contact with soil. And finally, many of us decorate for the holidays with fall straw bales. These can be put in a perimeter like you see. You can just add your compost materials, and as the straw bales break down, they will eventually become compost. So the actual process of making compost, it's basically 6 simple steps. We talked about the bin versus the pile, the different types of bins. We will go into the size and where you want to locate your bin. Other thing, ingredients, the do's and don'ts, what you want to put in, what you want to avoid. CN ratio, that's just going to be carbon to nitrogen or your brown and green materials. And then size to surface area. Basically, smaller items break down faster and decompose faster. And then moisture and aeration, that's basically keeping it wet and turning materials. And then finally, we talked about cooking, basically temp and time. So cook and wait. So if you're going to have a compost pile and you're going to make a bin yourself or a pile, you want to keep it 3 by 3 by 3 feet. And the maximum you could do would be 5 by 5 by any length. The downside of a large pile is that it's more difficult to turn. There's areas in the pile that you might miss, so you might have dry spots, wet spots. If your pile is too small, it's not going to generate enough heat. The other thing is when you site your compost bin or pile, you're going to want to have it close to a source of water. If you need to add water, if your materials are dry, certainly you're going to want to have a garden hose close at hand, and try to place it somewhere where it's convenient to your kitchen or garden or both. Certainly as you're gardening, you're going to put spent plant material in there. And your kitchen, you're definitely going to, when that compost pail is full, you're going to want to have quick, easy access to your compost bin. And it can be either on in sun or shade. It's more likely to dry out in the sun. It's more likely to stay cooler and damp in the shade. I actually move my bin around depending on the time of the year. In the summer, it'll be in a more shady location. In the winter, I put it someplace where it can get full sun to help heat up. And then the other thing is you want to keep it away from trees and shrubs if possible, because trees and shrubs like really good soil, and what you're going to be making is a really good soil amendment. So those trees and shrubs, their roots are going to be heading for that compost pile. So it's more just of an inconvenience. As you turn the pile, you're going to start, pulling up roots, and they're going to get tangled in the tines of the pitchfork. So what can be composted? Very important. You don't want to put the wrong items in. Animal bedding. If you live on a large piece of property and you keep chickens or goats or anything like that, any type of animal that is an herbivore that's only eating vegetables, you can certainly take their bedding, which is usually straw or hay, and you can add that. This is not the Tempur-Pedic bed that you got for your elderly dog or cat when we're talking about animal bedding. The other items are brush and leaves. I hope you will all take a vow. Never let your leaves leave your property. Become a leaf hoarder. I am a leaf hoarder. I do not let leaves out of my yard. I try to keep everything in my yard because leaves are a fantastic ingredient for compost. Coffee grounds, they're excellent. Coffee filters, if you use the paper filters, I happen to have a reusable filter. Eggshells are wonderful. You can break those up smaller. Crushing them is great. Also, all those fruit and veggie scraps that you have from all the meals that you make. And manure. Again, if you have chickens or any type of animal that is an herbivore, you can add their manure. It certainly will get your compost cooking. And then something you might not think about if you're still reading a newspaper, I read one on the weekends. You can add newspaper, paper towels, the paper towel rolls, and toilet paper rolls that look like cardboard but aren't. The spent plants from your yard, and certainly tea bags or loose tea can be added. The things you don't want to add: no dairy products, no dog or cat waste. There's too many pathogens in their waste. Meat and bones, fats, grease, oil, no fish. If it looks like something that an animal would eat, if you start putting meat, bones, fat, and fish in it, you will most definitely invite raccoons. They will love you for it. So don't do it. And then diseased plants, invasive plants, and weeds. Diseased plants, you can spread that, whatever disease it may have, it can spread. Invasive plants, they will take over. You certainly don't want that in your compost because you're going to spread it around your entire yard. And weeds will certainly love your compost and do very well in it. So we talk about CN ratio, and really, we're not going to go into a lot of chemistry. I'm terrible at chemistry and I'm terrible at math. So, and nobody needs to be a math or chemistry major or science major to make compost. Really, when we talk about carbon and CNN ratio, we're talking about brown materials, and it's really a quick visual. Brown materials look brown. So leaves, brush, the newspaper, those cardboard tubes, the paper towel tubes that we talked about. Also, paper, shredded paper. I shred all my paper at home. I put that into my compost bin. If I get short on leaves, I certainly give it to my worms in my worm bin, but that's a whole other presentation for another time. And also, believe it or not, cardboard. You could use cardboard if you were coming up short on leaves. So nitrogen materials are green materials. And again, a really good, easy visual is they tend to be green in nature. Think about lettuce, spinach, grass clippings, fresh green grass clippings. Hopefully ones that have not been treated with fertilizer or pesticides. And, your flower blossoms, and also, yes, your fruit and vegetable scraps. Not all fruits and vegetables are green, but they are a green material. They are high in nitrogen. And also the one color that's not correct is manure. Manure looks brown, but manure is actually very high in nitrogen. And the nitrogen materials, the green materials, they're what help heat up your compost pile. So we talked about size to surface area. Well, I always like to tell people if you take an entire watermelon and you throw it in your compost bin, it's going to decompose slowly because all of the insects and the bacteria, all of that, all the microorganisms, they're going to have that whole big round watermelon to deal with. It's big. They can only deal with the surface of it. But if you start chopping that watermelon up into smaller pieces, like you see in the other picture, where you see the orange peels and the watermelon rinds and the potato peels, it's going to give a lot more surface area for them to work on. Also, it's going to break down faster. So crush those eggshells, cut up the fruit and veggies. Even if you have like a big rotten apple, take it and slice it up so that it's easier for them to work on. And with leaves, you can throw leaves in whole, but it's going to break down faster if you can shred them. And I happen to have a leaf vacuum, so that shreds them up very nicely. But you can simply leave the leaves on your grass and run a lawnmower over it. It'll do the same thing and it will break down a lot faster. So moisture and aeration. This is where the garden hose close by comes in handy. You want to keep the pile evenly moist by watering it. As you're building your pile, you're going to add water. I'm a big advocate for, reach in, grab your compost and squeeze it. Feel your compost. Does it feel like a damp, wrung out sponge? Then you're doing it right. If there's water just dripping all over the place, it's probably too wet. And if it's crackly and dry, you need to add water. And then turning it. Every time you add something to your compost pile, you want to mix it because that's going to add air into it. Also, it's going to redistribute the materials in the bin. So all the materials in the center and the bottom of your compost bin, they're going to be breaking down faster, whereas the materials on the outer edge or at the top, they're going to look more like their original self. So you want to take those materials from the outer edge and the top and work them down into the middle and the bottom. Okay. Time and temperature. This is where the handy compost thermometer comes in. And as you'll see in the little diagram, yes, in the middle, in the very center of the compost pile is where it is going to be the hottest. And around it, it will be warm. And the closest to the sides are going to be cooler. Okay? If you build a hot pile, which we talk about in a few more slides, if it's built properly, your pile can heat up in about 1 to 2 days. Why do you want a hot pile? It's gonna break down faster. It's gonna decompose the materials faster. Also important, it's gonna kill weeds and diseases. Most people are cold composters. That's why I tell you not to put invasives or weeds or seed heads into your compost. But if you're a hot composter and you can get your temperatures up high enough, it will kill off the weeds and diseases. The other thing is that temperature probe is going to tell you what's going on in the pile. And if you look at that bright pink or magenta chart, you're going to see this wave-like motion with temperatures and days. And when you see the peak, that's when it's hot, and then you see it drop off. Well, that's when decomposition has started to slow down. But then you see another peak. That's because you've gone back in and you've turned your pile to get it activated and working again. And this cycle will continue until it levels off and your compost is done. And as you see, about 120 days, about 4 months. That's if you're actively composting. And if you're really type A about it, you can do it even quicker. So here we go, cold versus hot composting. The easiest way to compost is cold composting, and that's because it requires minimal effort. It's just simply taking ingredients and throwing them into the bin and letting it do its thing. You just wait. It's going to take a while. It's going to probably take you a year or two until it's fully composted. But the nice thing about it is you'll see this is one of those compost bins that has a door on the bottom. that little trap door you can open. And we talked about how things at the bottom and the center decompose and heat up more. Well, you can certainly harvest finished compost continually from the bottom of a cold pile. And then just keep adding to the top. I just tell you to always add a brown layer on top, just, to keep any type of wildlife that you don't want in it out of it. Now the hot pile, that's going to require a little more effort. You have to stockpile ingredients and then you have to add them all at once, fill the bin up to the very top. You're going to want to turn it frequently. You're going to put that compost thermometer in, but you will have finished compost in about 1 to 3 months. And I say err on the side of 3 months. Okay. So how do you actually build a hot compost pile? And what am I talking about when I say stockpile? Well, that geobin type, uh, the holding unit, not the enclosed unit. I have one of those, and that's what I use to stockpile green materials in. And I just keep adding those fruits, those vegetables, the coffee grounds, the prunings from my yard. And why I told you to never let a leaf leave your yard is because I also have a huge pile of leaves that I keep all year round that I can work off of. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to keep layering the green and brown materials and mix well. Add water as you go, okay? And then turn it. And remember that compost piles are going to require enough organic material to maintain microbial activity. You need volume. Volume is going to be important. So this is my pile. I built this in February. I was stockpiling green materials. I had plenty of leaves left over from the fall. So I kept layering them, alternating them. I checked to make sure that it was moist enough, not too dry. And remember, you're always going to need more brown materials. So when we talked about the CN ratio, remember this. You're always going to need a lot more in the way of brown material than you do in green materials. So it doesn't take very long to stockpile green materials because you don't need as much. Also, you're going to want to fill it to the very top. You'll see there that I've inserted the compost thermometer. And if this is done correctly, it's going to start to heat up in about 1 to 2 days. And I will tell you, this was February, the temperatures, this was a warmer day when I did it, but generally anywhere from below freezing to 40 degrees. So here is the process for the hot pile. As you can see, on day 4, the compost pile has started to heat up. The thermometer is reading 110 degrees. That's on a 40-degree day, so that's 70 degrees above the ambient temperature outside. So at one point, it did make it up to 120. Really, you need to get up to 140, 160 to kill weed seeds and diseases and invasive plants. That's why I always tell people to err on the side of caution and not add them. Can't always guarantee that it's going to hit that high. You've got a better chance of hitting those really high temps in the middle of summer because we have solar heat to help us along. But this is February and it's 40 degrees out and it's cooking right along at 100 degrees, 110. And if you look at the center picture, you can see that where it was at the top of the bin, it has now broken down. And in the final picture, you will see that it is almost to the bottom of the bin. That's how much it has broken down. So how do you know when compost is finished? It doesn't look like all those organic materials anymore. It looks like soil. It's dark, it's crumbly, it's going to smell sweet and earthy. You don't see any of the individual materials. You will probably still see a few eggshells, corn cobs if you had them, and certainly any type of pits that you may have had, say an avocado pit or peach pits. I can tell you the nice thing is I've gotten a few avocado trees out of my compost. The other thing is you're going to be amazed at how much volume is reduced. It's reduced by about 60 to 80%. So that huge pile of organic material that you had, it's going to be way down at the bottom of your bin. And how do you also know, besides looking at it, if you've turned it, you've done everything right, and it's not heating up anymore, it's done. But even when it's done, it still has to go through a curing phase. You don't want to take your compost out as soon as it's done and start flinging it on all of your garden beds. You're going to let it sit for about 4 weeks, and by then it will be ready to add to your planting beds and your gardens. So troubleshooting. I said you're not going to have any problems, but just in case you do, bad smells, and you don't want your neighbors to complain about what's going on in your backyard. So if you got an ammonia smell, you probably have too much nitrogen, too many green materials. They're wet and soggy. You want to add some more brown material. You're going to want to turn it, add the dry leaves. If there's a putrid smell, you got too much moisture, also compaction. So again, you're going to want to turn it and add brown materials. Most of the time, turning it and adding brown materials is going to fix whatever the problem is. Say you've got pests, flies, fruit flies, especially gnats, things like that. Animals, if you're putting the wrong ingredients in, you're going to get animals. I can assure you, if I get lazy in the summer and I just keep adding green materials, I'm going to go out there one day and I'm going to throw some, green materials in, and a wall of fruit flies is going to greet me. So I always have my leaves right close by so I can throw them on top. It keeps the fruit flies down. So remove any materials that you shouldn't have in there. Also, you may want to start using a cover on your bin. And then finally, low temp. What if it's not doing anything? Well, the pile might be too small. Again, you need a certain size, that 3 by 3 by 3. Also, there might not be enough moisture. You might not be turning it. Also, maybe not enough nitrogen or green materials. And it can just simply be cold weather. In winter, your compost pile is not going to get as hot, especially if you're not tending to it. If you're doing a cold pile, it will stay cold. And the other thing is, if you're trying to do an active hot pile and your pile is cold and it is cold out and maybe there's snow and it's freezing, or your pile is frozen, this is not the time to dig into it and start turning it. Just leave it alone until it gets warmer in the spring. All those little worms and insects, they're still going to be there. They're going to be working. They're just going to be a little more, working slowly. I always equate it to, if you're in bed and you're tucked in nice, warm, cozy with the blankets, do you want someone who's going to rip the covers off of you and start flinging you all over the place and exposing you to cold air? No. So just let it sit. There's enough insulation to keep those little guys working. So just wait until it gets warmer. The other thing is very important, just keep it insulated by keeping the lid on and using a bin. That's going to help a lot. So, and if it's not during cold temperatures, well, then you probably just need to add the green materials, the nitrogen, turn it, and add water. So that is it. The last thing I have is I love to read, and I hope you guys are all big readers. So just a few books that I can recommend. If you want to learn more about composting, there's a lot more that you can learn. There's recipes, there's more science, there's more math. You're welcome to it, but this is the simple version. And if you want to learn more about soil science, but you don't want to get your master's in it or start attending Cornell, then Soil Science for Gardeners. It makes it simple and easy. Mycelium Running, excellent. It'll give you a whole new look at what's going on underneath your feet with fungi. And then finally, a great, great autobiography, Lab Girl. Read this book. You will never look at the natural world, your garden, the soil, the plants, the trees around you again. You will see everything in a different, and I hope new and wonderful light. And my time is up. So if we have any questions, I know Becky and Steve have been working very hard. Anything out there that we need to cover?
Sandra, you give us far too much credit. You did the heavy lift tonight. Thank you so much for that great information. As with any good presentation, you actually answered a lot of the questions that came up. What I do want to let people know, so you can take a breath, Sandra, and just relax for a second, is Sandra has been kind enough to allow us to share her slides. So if you had questions on the troubleshooting or where to place a compost bin, her recommendations will be sent to you as part of the presentation. So hopefully you were able to see those when she did the talk, but you'll be able to see the slides when we send those out, but also the recording as well too. So we do have a couple of questions, Sandra, if you have some time.
Okay.
One of the questions that came in is, in putting grass clippings, should you be careful or should you add them to a compost pile if your grass has been treated with a fertilizer or other chemical or pesticide?
Okay. A really great answer for you, and this is the lazy way of doing it. We advocate grass cycling, and that's a really fancy term for you just leave the grass clippings on your lawn. A lot of people worry that this will create thatch. It's actually a misnomer. But you spend a lot of money and time to have a beautiful looking lawn, and you may be fertilizing it and adding pesticides. So, grass clippings in and of themselves are a wonderful source of nitrogen. And if you are fertilizing your lawn, why get rid of it or add it to the compost pile? Put it back down on your lawn. It's going to help your lawn. But if you are going to add grass clippings to a compost pile, it can be a green material if it's fresh and green, or it can be a brown material if you let it dry out. The thing to remember is if you have been adding fertilizers and pesticides, the old idea was always to let those grass clippings sit for at least 2 weeks to let that work its way out. The only problem is grass clippings, when they sit, they're high in moisture. So if you have a pile of grass clippings, you may get a wet, damp, nasty smelling mess on your hands. And that's actually one of the reasons that they did away with taking grass clippings at our composting facility, was the smell complaint. So my advice, just leave those grass clippings on your lawn. Most mowers now have what's known as a mulching blade on it, or you can buy a mulching mower. But most grind up, basically chop up the grass blades fine enough that you can put it back down on your grass and you are fertilizing it again. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, it did. Thank you, Sandra. One of the other questions that came in is when you were talking about the wildlife that can, come to your compost pile.
Yeah.
One person said noticeably that you did not mention rats or mice. Do you have any recommendations on either, keeping those out or finding some way to live in harmony with them?
Wow. Okay. Well, I've never had experience with mice or rats coming to my compost pile, and I think really it just comes down to keep the material covered, because if it looks like something you would eat, it's going to be something that they will eat. So that's really key to keeping that type of material, I mean, that type of animal out. And in all honesty, over all the years, I've maybe seen birds pick like worms out of my compost bin. And I have raccoons, possums, I have a groundhog that keeps making his presence known. So, and so far they've left the compost alone. I hope they leave my garden alone.
Just know that you're helping a whole ecosystem of life out there by having a compost bin, a
Yes,
compost pile.
and I think rats like garbage more. I've seen them more around garbage cans. So don't treat your compost like a garbage can.
And also considering what you can put in it, and you had mentioned the dairy and meat and stuff,
Mhm.
are you able to put in like those type of animal products if you have a closed container compost bin? Can you put in some of the, meats and dairies and stuff like that? Or is that not
Um,
advisable?
Not advisable at all. First of all, it is going to smell terrible. There are systems that you can compost meats and bones and all sorts of things like that, but we're talking about more of an industrial or a commercial composting situation. I do work with a gentleman who oversees the cafeteria, the food services for the Lawrenceville School. They have that capacity there, but that is certainly not what we're doing in our backyard. So no, absolutely no steak or steak bones in your compost bin.
Okay, so another question we had was adding paper products to a compost
Yes.
bin, especially those that are printed. Are
Mm.
there certain types of printed materials that you should not be adding to a compost pile?
I typically steer away from any glossy types of materials. And these are, these types of paper items are readily recycled in your curbside recycling. A lot of people always ask about the ink on newspapers,
Mhm.
and that type of paper is soy-based, so that's not a problem. The other thing, I didn't talk about it much, but I'm big on reducing waste. Your cereal boxes and pasta boxes, tissue boxes, that's not actually cardboard. A lot of people in Ocean County, other counties may recycle it, we don't. I actually do grind that up and I will add that to my compost if I need more brown material. But that's me trying to keep, stuff out of the waste stream.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you, Sandra. Someone else asked about possibly composting during the winter because they do, if you're doing the hot composting generating heat, is it possible to compost in the winter time?
Oh, absolutely. Composting is a year-round hobby. I never stop composting. And it's just because it may slow down in the winter, it doesn't mean that it's not doing anything. It's doing something. It's just doing it slower. And that's one of the reasons I moved my compost bin to a sunny location because I want any amount of heat I can get. And I freely admit that come January, I don't want to make a long trip to the far reaches of my property, all 75 by 100 square feet of it. I'm lazy. I like to take my compost pail and make a quick dash in the snow and the cold weather, dump it, and then get back to my sofa and the carbs and the reality TV. So, yes, compost year round. Do not think you have to stop. And another option, and we don't discuss it in this presentation, but vermicomposting, which is just a fancy word for having a worm bin. I do a lot more with my worm bin in the winter because I want to avoid the cold outdoor temperatures. So.
All right. Another question we had is, if you already covered it, could you reiterate why you need to let the compost cure and not just when it's done, just dump it on your yard or in your garden?
Okay. Well, it's still as much as it looks finished, it still has a little more work to do. And a lot of times, like it would certainly be nowhere near as bad as if you took fresh manure. If you take fresh manure and you put that onto your garden, that's going to create a nitrogen burn situation because it's so high in nitrogen and it's still breaking down. The compost, by letting it cure, it just allows that last little processing that it has to do. And also, some of us aren't perfect. It may still be, decomposing. It may look really finished to us, but it may still have a little work to do. So just err on the side of caution. Let it sit there and you can start a whole nother compost pile while you're waiting for that. I know we're very eager to garden right now.
I know the weather's nice. We want to get outside in any way, shape, or form. A couple of people have asked about compost starters
Hmm.
or any sort of amendment to the compost to help it kind of decompose faster. What are your thoughts on the use of those or not?
You're welcome to try them. I know many companies, if you go on the internet, you can find, compost activator or starter. I've just actually never really used it myself. I'm just a lazy composter. So, but I would say if you want to try it, go for it. One of these days I'm going to do it just so I can say I've done it and tried it.
Mhm.
But it's not necessary, but experiment. That's how I got into worm composting, by experimenting with worm bins. So,
All right, thank you. Someone also is asking, do you have to turn your pile every time you add new ingredients?
You don't have to. It's recommended. This falls under the do as I say, don't do as I do. So, I will admit, that every winter I let my compost pile get a little too wet, a little too full of green materials. And by spring, it's a little anaerobic. So that hot pile that I showed you was actually me restarting my compost pile that I let go. So, you know, yeah, turn it, aerate it. But if you don't, you know, the compost police will not come out and arrest you. It's just advisable, but it's still compost. In fact, my last presentation that I gave to my master composters in the winter was about restarting, a compost pile that's gone dormant. And, I said, this is what I did and it stinks. And there's sections that are wet and mucky. Thank goodness I have all those brown leaves. So none of us are perfect.
Um, for those people, there are a couple people who are asking about compost in raised beds. I'm trying to frantically find the recent fact sheet from Rutgers Cooperative Extension and Stephanie Murphy, who runs our soil testing lab, where she talks about soil for raised beds. So I'm hoping to answer that question for people and take it off of Sandra's back. But I'll throw that in the chat for those people who are interested in that. But somebody's asking about like lobster and shrimp shells. If you can put eggshells in, can you put those shells in as well?
Well, they're going to take a very long time to break down. And again, do you really want to feed the raccoons, the mice, and possibly the rats? So, no, I wouldn't do it, especially if you're just first starting. And I'm going to have to look into that a little more closely because now I'm thinking about this and I am intrigued by it. So, certainly, I'll do a little more research on that, and maybe I can get back to you, Steve, on that one.
Mhm. I just Oh, thank you. Becky jumped out on the fact sheet for me as well. I just put that in the chat. So thank you, Becky, for that.
Oh, and I
As
do
well.
know there is one, and I cannot think of it, but I believe it's a West African method where you have a raised bed or a garden bed, and basically you sink the compost into it and I'm not talking about trench composting, where you would actually have like a bin, but you sink it into the ground and you put the composting materials into it. So that is another method out there. And for the life of me, the name of it is escaping me.
Okay. We are getting fast and furiously a whole bunch of questions, but I will also say we've been getting a lot of compliments on how great of a job you did and how thorough this presentation was and how excellent of a job you did. So if we do not get to everyone's questions tonight, we will save the chat and the Q&A and see what we can do to help you guys as well.
Yeah.
But somebody's asking about compost from local townships and municipalities. They want to know if that's good to use. Of course, if you're living in Ocean County, we will say that's we know you can speak specifically for that county, but is that kind of situation, is that good for use?
Okay, I can speak specifically to Ocean County, but I would think this would be true around the state. In Ocean County, there's a lot of, I even have people that have been in community gardens with me who would like badmouth the compost or the mulch or any of the materials from our composting facility. The first thing you have to know is we have to test that. We are required by the NJDEP to test it. So those materials are tested. They're wonderful materials. And I can honestly tell you right now, because I could not make enough compost on my own to replenish my beds this year, there is a second huge pile of compost that came from my town's public works. And in Ocean County, to speak to that specifically, every town, your public works will or should have compost and mulch available to you. That all comes from our facility in Ocean County, either the Northern Recycling Center in Lakewood or the Southern Recycling Center in Stafford. And some towns, the larger towns, they make their own on-site, but they use our equipment. We basically come there and do that for them. And that is also tested. So,
Okay.
an excellent resource.
I'll just hit you with one more question, but before then, I will tell you that based upon some of the questions that we're getting, that I'm sure both Becky and I would be interested in talking to you about a composting class, because some people are asking about specifically with worms and like, can we get that class? So we'll be talking with Sandra in the future about getting that worm composting class going. So if you have questions on that, we'll
sounds
do
great.
that.
And if anyone needs or has questions, my contact information is below. We have OC Recycles where residents can send questions to us. We just recently launched Compost at, CO Ocean NJ US, and that's where people can send us composting questions. And if you want to quickly peruse our website, which is listed there. You can certainly go on. I believe if you go to the composting, we do have a brief little slide to show you real quickly how to build your own worm bin. But yes, the presentation is so much better. And I have large worms.
And so I'll just hit you with this last question, but thank you for the extra time tonight, Sandra. Does compost tea have any value?
Yes, compost tea does have value. And what it is basically don't have much time to go into it, but basically, yes, it has value. You can use it as a fertilizer. You can water your plants with it. You can put it in a spray bottle and use it as a foliar fertilizer. And basically, it's taking finished compost. You're putting it in a cheesecloth bag. You're soaking it in water, and it's even better if you aerate it with a small pump. Certainly go online. You will find information about that where it gives you, the ratio of how much compost in the bag to how much water and how long to aerate for. But yes, it's a wonderful product.
All right. Thank you again, Sandra. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone who joined us this evening. We do have Sandra's contact information, so if you have any questions, feel free to send them her way as well. But thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for an excellent presentation, Sandra. It was great information and really hands-on and practical, and that's what we appreciate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. I agree. It was phenomenal. Lots of great information that people can put right to use tomorrow. So thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you, Becky.